Affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan, and let me begin my show with a set of questions. I have a small graphic that I'd like to present to you. It's titled The Diminishing Dollar. Is the US dollar entering a state of gradual eclipse? Is the US dollar's dominance as the currency of world trade under threat? If so, how and why? Could there be a time when other national currencies, including perhaps the Indian rupee, could be used in international trade? And finally, the push for digital currencies and what impact this could have. So that's my graphic for you. And to answer some of these questions that the issues throw up, I have with me Dr. Suranjali Tandon. You've met her before on our channel. She is an assistant professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. In other words, she's a trade expert, an international trade expert. Suranjali, thank you. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Surya.
Now, a week ago, Gita Gopinath of the IMF had warned that the financial sanctions imposed on Russia by the US could gradually dilute the dominance of the US dollar and result in a more fragmented international monetary system. Is this, would you explain how this is happening?
Yeah, Surya, so we're seeing sort of shift across the world in terms of how trade is carried or executed between countries. So, for example, imagine if India imports certain goods from the US, it has to pay in dollars, and similarly, when it exports, it will be paid in a currency which is of international recognition. Over a period of time, we've noticed that the US dollar has come to dominate global trade. About 60% of transactions in international finance, as well as in exchange of goods and services, is executed through the US dollar. This is essentially a sanction of the other governments to say that there is faith in the US dollar as a means of exchange. That is being challenged, in my opinion, over the last month and a half or so. That we're seeing escalation of stress in trade from the political scenario that we're seeing with Russia. Now, how is that strained? It's because there are different kinds of economic sanctions that are being imposed. So first, Russia was put off the SWIFT channel, especially specific selected banks were put off the SWIFT mechanism. Then there was a freeze on the central banking assets, which basically means that if transactions are to be carried out, Russia may have to rely on other currencies, on other means of payment. And the statement that you just quoted is maybe an accurate representation and is a result of these political tensions and sanctions. So, for example, Russia has started looking to China for much of its trade in goods. Now, you can imagine a scenario where Russia looks at different currencies or payment mechanisms which are bilaterally negotiated with China. Similarly, because Russia is an important supplier of oil and gas, so it could work out similar deals with other countries wherein the means of payments are different. And so therefore, if this sets a template for other countries that you can exchange in currencies other than the dollar, you might see a fragmentation of the international financial system where specific currencies might gain traction over a period of time.
Mm-hmm. So basically what you're saying is that the use of the dollar for political purposes, weaponizing the dollar, has resulted in this situation. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so that's a good term to use for the situation at the moment. See, at the end of the day, what we're noticing is that political sanctions have not amounted to much. Russia has continued with business as usual. The only way to wean it off its economic power is to hold up the assets that the central bank holds, which holds the value of the ruble. So you could say to that extent, the US weaponizes the US dollar to sort of control the world. It also comes from the economic structure of US, of its historically its political power. So over a period of time, because of its size of transactions with the economy, the flow of capital from it gave it the economic power, and I guess now. Because there are so many different kinds of currencies, there are different kinds of trading arrangements available. It allows the US to then test its power with the weaponization, as you're saying, through sanctions.
Mhm. So long term, is this good or bad? I mean, using this thing as a political weapon, it's not good in the long term, is it?
So, any economic power, when it turns into political power, is not a good situation, right? So, a lot of people have looked at the Chinese yuan, for example, with some degree of skepticism, and that is because of the underlying political power in China, the political structure there. So, I believe that any currency, which is a signal of power, is used to manipulate global trade or is used to yield power, is not a preferable situation. At least from an economist's point, I would say that it's not a preferable situation at all.
Mhm. So, say comparing the US dollar and the Chinese yuan, would you say the dollar is far more transparent in the way it functions, or the US government is more transparent in the way it functions as compared to say the Chinese government is, therefore it is more credible?
So, as I said, Surya, it's all perceptions of governance. So, for example, the US has, right from World War II, relayed what it thinks in terms of politics, what it thinks in terms of economics. And because of the democratic structure, the currency is taken more seriously. So I would imagine that if yuan were to displace the US dollar, it would take a lot more effort because there are capital controls which are regulatory hindrances, and second, there are political concerns. So imagine now today, central banks hold US dollars as assets. Now, tomorrow, if China follows a policy which is driven internally based on its own conception of what the domestic economy should look like, which the US may do as well, but there is no explicit political element to that. And to that extent, it might create uncertainty across central banks that may hold yuan as a value and for transacting. So that's my sort of long answer for why uh, US dollar still perhaps remains significant in global transactions and in global finance.
Because I presume it has other connotations. It represents a liberal democratic value system. Do these things count?
So I think at the end of the day, in economics, the first lesson that you're taught, these values are driven by the structure of the economy, the way the economy interacts with other jurisdictions, what are the size of these transactions, so what are the capital flows, etc. But some part of this is also how you perceive the political structures in these economies. So let's say there was another currency. Let's not even look at China, but let's say another currency where the political scenario is unstable. It would be very hard to peg international currencies to that value because the anchor itself is shaky. So yeah, so I would imagine it derives in part. The extent you may not be able to estimate, but it derives in part from the politics of the country that is anchoring the world currencies.
So there is talk of the Chinese using telling the Saudis, we'll pay for our oil in yuan. Uh, is that more a political thing, or is it grounded in some kind of I mean, how does it work?
So that in part again, it goes back to where we started to say economic relationships are forged on the basis of reciprocity. So it could be that the oil exporting countries and China have a mutually beneficial relationship where both export and import equivalent amounts, and there the use of an alternative currency is absolutely possible. So even where we go back and look at the situation where there was a sanction on Iran, India figured out a way of making payments. So it's possible to use an alternative currency to start transacting, and that's why we're saying that there is a possibility of fragmentation of the international financial market. The other is that China itself, for the longest time, has had the intent of gaining some traction in the global currency market. At the moment, it's fractional, if at all absent, but you might see that if it can forge such bilateral relationships, even if it doesn't displace the dollar, it could become relatively more useful means of transacting with specific blocks of countries.
So let's look at the Indian rupee. Does it have that? I mean, tell me about the Indian rupee.
Yeah, so I think there's much more distance to cover in terms of the Indian rupee being a comparable because of the dependencies of other countries in for their imports with India, and Indian companies investing abroad, or individuals in India investing abroad. So I would say that. No, India cannot be the dominant currency at all for the moment. And even in terms of internationalization, we've seen examples, we've seen bits and pieces of it happening. But for it to truly gain traction or even create some kind of an interest towards internationalization, I think there's a long way to go.
So, say people are talking of India again resorting to rupee ruble trade with the Russians. This is kind of harking back to what it used to be in the past. How does this work?
So this basically means that they will set up basically means of payments will be through ruble. The conversion is directly to ruble. It's not intervened by dollar. So any supplies that are made to India, India will have to purchase ruble from the market and pay Russia, and then vice versa. So for example, if Russia is purchasing from India, it will pay Indian rupees, is what I imagine could be. It could also be that they settle in ruble depending on the exchange rate. Now, that again shows that all these sanctions have certain limits. So where the US tries to wean off Russia from its economic ties and its ability to maintain its external account, it's limited to the extent that other countries are willing to trade irrespective of these sanctions. So similarly, Russia has worked this out with China, and I'd imagine that there would be other countries who are willing to do so, especially because there are goods that are inelastic to prices, which are energy driven, right? So, for example, oil and gas. So, to the extent that contributes a major share of trade between a country and Russia, you would see that these ties are forged between Russia and the countries.
So, and the rupee ruble trade, does it help us more? Does it help the Russians more? I mean, who benefits really?
So yeah, you're basically asking about the trade between Europe and Russia, between the euro and ruble.
Yeah, and the rupee and ruble also.
Yeah, so see, it benefits Russia because it's able to diversify its foreign assets, right? Because now instead of doing this through dollars and accumulating dollars, where it receives more payments than pays out, now it's going to get euro, it's going to get other currencies. To the extent that it gets relatively stronger currencies, for example, the euro, it further strengthens Russia because These assets are not held in volatile currencies, which may shift in value based on their own domestic economies. The tricky thing with euro is that at the moment they wish to levy more, apply more sanctions on Russia, but they are dependent on oil and gas as well as other resources on Russia. So long as those sanctions don't go through, you would also see sort of an increase in euro ruble trade.
Mhm. What about India and Russia? When we go back to when we do this rupee ruble trade, does it help both of us? Does it minimize our dollar transactions to that extent? Does it help us?
So it helps us because we are trying to meet our own energy demand, which is substantial. There was also talk of the price at which oil may be imported, and honestly, if we have to make that transition away from oil, we need to sort of also save our public finances. So I guess in that sense, it benefits us to find an alternative to the dollar. I don't know how possible this may be for imports with other countries. So, Russia is still a very small fraction of India's overall trade basket.
Yeah.
So, I would say that while the benefit is there, it's limited.
Mhm. So it could be for short term, perhaps, to tide over the current turmoil in the international markets.
Yes. So, to the extent that Russia is supplying, as I said again, it's supplying resources like oil and gas. The terms of trade as well as the price. So, if you look, China has been very explicit about the fact that if we are getting oil at a competitive price, then so be it. Why should we sort of deny ourselves the
Yeah.
imports? I think it's an economic decision at the end of the day. If you look at our balance of payments or current account deficit, large part of it is attributed to oil. So to that extent, if we are able to get a benefit, I think it's good for India. But as I said again, we import from a block of countries, so it's not as if this will translate into very substantive gains, unless of course Russia's oil exports continuing will bring down prices in the oil market or stabilize oil prices. I would say that it's good, but to a limited extent.
Mhm. So the IMF has warned about the fragmentation of the international monetary system. One set of countries following the dollar, another set perhaps yuan, ruble. Um, what happens when this kind of fragmentation happens?
So the immediate impact that I would imagine is that there would be a competition for the United States currency, so the dollar. With the fragmentation, basically, you're saying that there are other means to transact, and different banks will begin to question on whether this is a good reserve currency. There will be others who will say, well, do we need the dollar at all now to transact, or can we forge other kinds of means of payments or bilateral arrangements which are outside the dollar framework? So I think the fragmentation will bring in a new age of global currency. At least, if not a new currency, at least a conversation around what is the new global currency for the 21st century.
Mhm. Now, the Chinese have moved to the idea of an Asian basket of currencies. What are they talking about? Yen, I
Um,
presume?
so as I believe, it could be a combination of different currencies. Again, the Asian countries are not always similar, even in terms of whether there's economic profile or objective. So, for example, you have Indonesia, which is dependent on oil. You have other countries which trade very differently. So, for example, many of these countries will continue to trade with the US, will continue to trade with the Middle East, and to that extent, even if they were to form a currency of their own, it would again be pegged against a more international currency, right? So US could continue to be important. It's just that between Asian countries, if the trade is to be carried out, it might offer some more ease. But I would say that again, if digital currencies become they proliferate, the need for such arrangements again need to be re-examined in that light.
Yeah, so that brings me to this digital currencies. India itself is floating the idea of a digital rupee. Where are we going? Does it make all these dollar, shoulder, and all that? Does that make it irrelevant?
So, I feel as if the digital currency is a natural progression because of how financial markets are progressing. So, most countries are now thinking about, even if they've not implemented a new digital currency. That's because central banks want more transparency, central banks want more ease of transaction, and digital currencies offer that alternative. There's also a need to regulate cryptos, and therefore defining what a national currency is helps mimic virtual digital currency with fiat. So I would imagine that India's announcement of the CBDC is in fact quite timely and might be useful, because if you look at how it's panned out in the US is sat quietly and observe what's happening around the world, and experts are now warning that having sat so long and thought about it, US might miss the opportunity of remaining relevant, and there's some haste there. So I guess India's really taken the lead there to think about CBDCs.
So this digital currency, it would have the same value vis-a-vis, say, the dollar as the current physical rupee.
Uh, I would think that immediately you would say that it's the same as the currency that exists today, and therefore the underpinning value is the same. But if we say that digital currencies are difficult to sort of keep within an economic jurisdiction, they're more easier to transact in and gain traction for transacting cross border, there might be a change in relative value, because it automatically shifts the demand for dollar, shifts the demand for other currencies. So you could see an impact across exchange rates.
Uh-huh. Does that help us?
It will really depend on how India's digital currency is perceived. If it is used at all as significantly as China is imagining its own digital currency will be used, you might see an improvement in the exchange rate for India. That makes your imports cheaper, but then again,
Yeah.
it would make your exports costly. So it's all, I would say, time will tell.
Yeah. But you would say that this push towards digital currencies is now going to go forward no matter what?
I would say it's unstoppable, because you observed a massive shift on the investment side as well, right? So the adoption and the use of cryptos really splits people in half. There are those who support it and those who don't, and that in a way signals that something has changed in the financial markets. To mimic that, central banks across the world are seriously thinking about it. If you look at most major banks, there is research being undertaken on how viable and how useful a digital currency will be. With that kind of effort being invested, I would say that digital currencies are going to be part of the future very much.
So, dumping the dollar would be premature, but it could happen sometime in the future.
Yeah, I would say that replacing the US dollar is a little tricky, because at the moment it sits on central banks' balance sheets. It's being used already as a currency. So, to say tomorrow US will be irrelevant is a very easy answer, which is not nuanced at
Yeah.
all. I do not see the dollar going away immediately from the international market as a dominant currency. But what we're seeing panning out is, at least, as I said, a template or an example of how there exists a system outside the dollar. And to the extent this catches the imagination of many countries, you could see the decline of the dollar as a dominant currency.
And we won't have to walk around with all the wallets that we do, and everything will be on through the phone, I presume.
So even today, if you look at the kinds of transactions that you undertake, a lot of them are digitally executed. Right from your wallets to your ATM cards and everything. So I would say that it's not going to be as jarring a transition, and you might actually see that you don't have to hold your rupee notes anymore. You may as well do that in digital wallets.
Fascinating. Suranjali Tandon, great talking to you, great insight. Thank you very much. And I'm sure this conversation will keep us going forward, looking ahead for more such chats in the future.
Thank you.
And for those of you who have tuned into this conversation, thank you for your comments and observations. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on our social media, including Twitter. Thank you very much. Good night.